1798, Salem's most revered convent became the epicenter of systematic disappearances that authorities refused to investigate. The Sisters of Divine Mercy had operated in Salem for over 3 decades, their pristine white habits a familiar sight on the cobblestone streets, where witch trials had once terrorized the community. But behind the convent's stone walls, beneath the daily prayers and charitable works, a different kind of darkness was taking root. Young women who entered seeking spiritual refuge would vanish without explanation, their families told they had chosen a life of complete devotion in distant missions. The truth, buried in medical records and hastily sealed church documents, would reveal a systematic program of human experimentation disguised as religious devotion, one that the Massachusetts colonial government would go to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The institution's reputation. The Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent stood like a beacon of righteousness on Salem's Gallows Hill, its Gothic spires casting long shadows over the town that had once burned with accusations of witchcraft. Founded in 1765 by Mother Superior Margaret Wells, the convent had earned an impeccable reputation throughout Massachusetts Bay Colony as a sanctuary for wayward women and a center of charitable works. The irony of its location, built deliberately on the site where 19 alleged witches had been executed, was not lost on the townspeople, who viewed the convent as a symbol of Salem's redemption from its dark past. Mother Superior Wells, a woman of stern countenance and unwavering faith, had arrived from Boston with substantial financial backing from wealthy Protestant families who saw the establishment of a Catholic institution as a gesture of religious tolerance. Her vision was ambitious: create a self-sufficient community where women could dedicate their lives to service while contributing to the broader welfare of Salem's growing population. The convent's mission statement, carved in Latin above the main entrance, proclaimed their dedication to purifying the soul through discipline and sacrifice. The physical structure of the convent was imposing and purposeful. The main building, constructed of local granite quarried from the nearby hills, featured thick walls designed to withstand New England's harsh winters. The complex included a chapel with stained glass windows imported from Europe, living quarters for the sisters, an infirmary, workshops for various crafts, and extensive underground storage areas that townspeople assumed were used for food preservation and wine storage. The convent's gardens were meticulously maintained, producing herbs and vegetables that were distributed to Salem's poor, further cementing their reputation as pillars of the community. The architectural design reflected both practical needs and spiritual aspirations. The chapel, with its soaring ceiling and intricate stone carvings, could accommodate nearly 200 worshippers during special services. The living quarters were spartanly furnished but comfortable, with each sister having her own small cell equipped with a bed, desk, and crucifix. The workshops were state-of-the-art for their time, featuring spinning wheels, looms, and tools for various crafts that generated income for the convent. The kitchen and dining facilities were designed to serve large numbers efficiently, with massive hearths and preparation areas that could feed both residents and the many visitors who came seeking the sisters' charitable services. The underground areas, which would later prove to be far more extensive than anyone suspected, were initially presented as practical storage and utility spaces. The cellars contained vast quantities of preserved foods, wines, and supplies necessary for the convent's operations. What impressed visitors was the apparent efficiency and organization of these spaces, which seemed to demonstrate the sisters' practical wisdom and forward-thinking approach to self-sufficiency. The underground complex extended far beyond what was visible to casual observers, with multiple levels and chambers that had been excavated over many years of careful construction. By 1780, the Sisters of Divine Mercy had grown from the original 12 women to over 40, with new novices arriving regularly from across New England. The convent operated a school for girls from prominent families, a medical clinic that served the town's most destitute residents, and several charitable programs that provided food and clothing to those in need. Mother Superior Wells had established relationships with Salem's political and business leaders, regularly hosting dinners where she would discuss the convent's work and solicit continued support for their missions. The educational programs offered by the convent were remarkably progressive for their time. Young women from wealthy families were instructed not only in traditional feminine accomplishments like needlework and music, but also in mathematics, natural philosophy, and even basic medical knowledge. The library, which contained over 3,000 volumes, included works on science, medicine, and philosophy that were rare even in major cities. Parents were impressed by the intellectual development of their daughters, who often returned home with knowledge and perspectives that exceeded what they might have gained from private tutors. The curriculum developed by Mother Superior Wells was comprehensive and sophisticated, covering subjects rarely taught to women in colonial America. Students learned Latin and French, studied anatomy and physiology, and were introduced to the latest scientific theories and medical practices. The convent's approach to education was based on the belief that intellectual development was essential for spiritual growth and that women could contribute meaningfully to society through both scholarly pursuits and practical service. The teaching methods employed at the convent were innovative and effective. Rather than relying solely on rote memorization, the sisters encouraged critical thinking and practical application of knowledge. Students conducted scientific experiments, participated in medical procedures under supervision, and engaged in philosophical discussions that challenged conventional wisdom. This approach produced graduates who were unusually well-educated and confident, qualities that made them highly sought after as wives, teachers, and community leaders. The sisters themselves were widely respected for their dedication and apparent purity. They maintained strict vows of silence during most of the day, spoke only when necessary, and were known for their pale complexions and thin frames, attributes that townspeople interpreted as signs of their spiritual devotion and self-sacrifice. Dr. James Franklin, Salem's primary physician, frequently praised the sisters' medical knowledge, particularly their understanding of herbal remedies and their ability to care for patients during difficult recoveries. The daily routine at the convent was structured around the canonical hours, with prayers and religious observances interspersed with practical work. The sisters rose at 4 in the morning for matins, followed by a light breakfast and assignment to their various duties. Some worked in the gardens, tending to vegetables and herbs that were distributed to the poor. Others labored in the workshops, producing textiles, candles, and other goods that were sold to support the convent's operations. The most skilled sisters worked in the medical clinic, treating patients with remedies that often proved more effective than conventional treatments available elsewhere. What made the convent particularly noteworthy was its progressive approach to women's education and healthcare. Unlike many religious institutions of the time, the Sisters of Divine Mercy encouraged literacy among all residents and maintained an extensive library that included medical texts, philosophical works, and scientific journals. Mother Superior Wells herself was remarkably well educated, fluent in Latin, French, and German, and known to correspond with scholars from Harvard College and other institutions of higher learning. Her correspondence, which was frequently displayed to visitors as evidence of the convent's intellectual rigor, included exchanges with prominent theologians, physicians, and natural philosophers throughout New England and Europe. The intellectual atmosphere at the convent was unlike anything found in other religious institutions of the period. The sisters engaged in scholarly discussions during their evening gatherings, debating theological questions, scientific theories, and philosophical concepts with a sophistication that impressed even the most educated visitors. Mother Superior Wells encouraged this intellectual engagement, believing that spiritual growth required not only faith, but also reasoned understanding of the world and its complexities. The convent's library was particularly renowned for its collection of medical texts and scientific treatises. The sisters had acquired works by the most prominent physicians and natural philosophers of their time, including detailed anatomical studies, treatises on surgical procedures, and explorations of human psychology and behavior. This collection was not merely for display. The sisters actively studied these works and applied their knowledge in their medical practice and educational programs. The convent's financial stability was another source of admiration and curiosity. Through careful management of donations, successful craft production, and what appeared to be shrewd investments, the sisters had accumulated substantial wealth. They owned property throughout Salem and the surrounding areas, operated several small businesses, including a successful apothecary and a textile workshop that supplied merchants in Boston, and maintained accounts with banks in Boston, New York, and even Philadelphia. This financial independence allowed them to expand their charitable works and maintain their facilities without relying on the often unstable support of the colonial government. The success of their business ventures was attributed to Mother Superior Wells' exceptional administrative abilities and what appeared to be remarkable foresight in identifying profitable opportunities. The convent's apothecary, established in 1774, became renowned throughout Massachusetts for producing medicines that were both effective and reasonably priced. Their textile workshops produced goods of such quality that they attracted orders from merchants who supplied markets as far away as Charleston and Savannah. The agricultural operations, which included not only vegetable gardens, but also herb cultivation and small-scale livestock breeding, generated surplus that was sold at premium prices in local markets. The financial records of the convent, meticulously maintained by Mother Superior Wells and her assistants, showed a level of prosperity that exceeded that of many commercial enterprises. The institution's diversified income streams provided stability and growth that allowed for continuous expansion of their facilities and programs. The sisters had invested in land, businesses, and financial instruments that generated steady returns, creating a foundation of wealth that seemed to ensure the convent's long-term sustainability. Local families viewed the convent as an ideal destination for daughters who showed little interest in marriage or who had suffered personal tragedies. The sisters welcomed these young women with open arms, offering them purpose, education, and a sense of belonging that was often difficult to find elsewhere in colonial society. Parents took comfort in knowing their daughters were in a safe, supervised environment where they could contribute meaningfully to society while living according to Christian principles. The transformation that many of these young women underwent was remarkable. Girls who had been considered difficult or troubled at home often became model citizens under the sisters' guidance. The selection process for new residents was thorough and appeared highly professional. Prospective novices underwent extensive interviews with Mother Superior Wells and several senior sisters, during which their educational background, family circumstances, and personal motivations were carefully evaluated. Those who were accepted often came from families that could provide substantial donations to the convent, though Wells was careful to also accept some young women from modest backgrounds to maintain the institution's reputation for charitable service. The interviews conducted with prospective residents were comprehensive and probing. Mother Superior Wells had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed her to assess each candidate's suitability for convent life. She explored their educational background, family relationships, personal struggles, and spiritual motivations, with questions that revealed their character, intelligence, and potential for growth. The process could take several days, during which candidates stayed at the convent and participated in daily activities to demonstrate their commitment and compatibility. The convent's medical clinic, established in 1772, became particularly renowned for its treatment of women's ailments. Dr. Franklin often referred patients to the sisters when conventional treatments proved ineffective, and many families credited the convent with saving their daughters' lives during difficult illnesses. The sisters' apparent expertise in areas such as childbirth complications, nervous disorders, and chronic pain made them invaluable to Salem's medical community. What impressed medical professionals was the sisters' systematic approach to treatment, their detailed record-keeping, and their willingness to try innovative procedures when traditional methods failed. The clinic's reputation extended beyond Salem, attracting patients from throughout Massachusetts and even from neighboring colonies. Women suffering from conditions that other physicians had declared incurable often found relief through the sisters' treatments. The success rate was remarkable, though the sisters were careful to explain that their methods required extended stays at the convent for full effectiveness. Patients who underwent treatment typically remained at the facility for several months, during which time they received round-the-clock care and attention. The medical facilities at the convent were equipped with the most advanced instruments and equipment available in colonial America. The sisters had invested heavily in surgical tools, diagnostic equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies that rivaled those found in the finest hospitals of Boston and Philadelphia. The treatment rooms were designed with careful attention to hygiene and efficiency, featuring stone surfaces that could be easily cleaned, drainage systems for managing bodily fluids, and lighting arrangements that allowed for precise work even during evening hours. Political leaders also held the convent in high regard. Governor Samuel Warren made several official visits to the institution, praising the sisters' contributions to Massachusetts's social welfare and their role in maintaining civil order. The convent's influence extended beyond Salem, with representatives from other colonies visiting to study their methods and consider establishing similar institutions in their own territories. Warren frequently cited the Sisters of Divine Mercy as an example of how religious institutions could contribute to the broader goals of colonial society, providing both spiritual guidance and practical services that benefited the entire community. The relationship between the convent and local government was one of mutual respect and cooperation. The sisters regularly consulted with colonial officials on matters related to public health, social welfare, and education. Their advice was particularly valued during times of crisis, such as disease outbreaks or economic hardship, when their resources and expertise proved invaluable to the community's survival. In return, government officials provided the convent with protection from criticism and interference, recognizing that the institution's work was essential to maintaining social stability. The political connections maintained by Mother Superior Wells were extensive and strategically important. She corresponded regularly with officials throughout New England, sharing information about social conditions, health concerns, and economic opportunities that might affect colonial policy. Her insights were particularly valued because of her institution's unique position at the intersection of religious life, medical practice, and social service, giving her access to information and perspectives that were unavailable to other advisors. The sisters' daily routine was rigid and purposeful, designed to maximize both spiritual development and practical productivity. They rose before dawn for prayer, worked in their various assignments throughout the day, and spent evenings in study or meditation. Visitors consistently reported being impressed by the sisters' discipline, their apparent contentment, and their dedication to their vows. The convent's reputation for transforming troubled young women into productive members of society made it a model institution that other religious communities sought to emulate. The spiritual life of the convent was characterized by a unique blend of traditional Catholic practices and innovative approaches to religious devotion. Mother Superior Wells had developed what she called contemplative medicine, a practice that combined prayer with medical treatment in ways that seemed to enhance the effectiveness of both. The sisters spent hours each day in meditation and prayer, but these spiritual exercises were often combined with practical activities, such as preparing medicines or caring for patients. This integration of spiritual and practical life was seen as one of the convent's greatest innovations. The theological framework developed by Mother Superior Wells emphasized the connection between physical and spiritual health, arguing that true healing required attention to both the body and the soul. This philosophy informed all aspects of the convent's work, from their educational programs to their medical practice. The sisters were taught to view their service as a form of prayer, and their scholarly pursuits as a means of understanding God's creation more fully. By 1795, the Sisters of Divine Mercy had become so integral to Salem's identity that the town's official seal included an image of the convent alongside other significant landmarks. The institution had successfully positioned itself as both a spiritual center and a practical contributor to the community's welfare. Mother Superior Wells, now in her 60s but still vigorous and commanding, was frequently consulted on matters of public policy and social reform. Her opinions carried weight not only because of her religious authority, but also because of her demonstrated success in managing complex operations and her apparent understanding of human nature. The convent's success attracted attention from religious and secular authorities throughout New England. Delegations from other colonies regularly visited to observe their methods and discuss potential collaborations. The sisters' combination of religious devotion, practical skills, and social consciousness made them a unique and valuable institution in colonial America's rapidly evolving social landscape. Plans were already underway to establish similar institutions in other locations, with Mother Superior Wells serving as an advisor to these new ventures. The reputation of the Sisters of Divine Mercy was built on decades of consistent service, apparent success in their various endeavors, and the testimony of countless individuals who had benefited from their work. The institution had weathered various challenges and criticisms, emerging stronger and more respected with each passing year. The sisters had demonstrated that religious devotion and practical effectiveness could be successfully combined, creating an institution that served both spiritual and temporal needs. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade of respectability and service, signs of something far more sinister were beginning to emerge. The very elements that made the convent appear so admirable, its isolation, its financial independence, its medical expertise, and its influence with local authorities, would prove to be the perfect cover for activities that would have horrified the community that held the sisters in such high regard. The transformation of young women that had been so widely praised would soon be revealed to have a much darker explanation than anyone had imagined. Ignored signs. The first troubling signs emerged in the spring of 1796, though they were initially dismissed as the natural consequences of religious life. Families began to notice that daughters who entered the convent as novices seemed to undergo dramatic physical changes within months of their arrival. Helen Brooks, who had entered the convent as a healthy 18-year-old from a prosperous merchant family, appeared drastically different when her parents visited 6 months later. Her once robust frame had become gaunt, her complexion had taken on an unusual pallor, and she seemed to have difficulty maintaining focus during conversations. The changes in Helen Brooks were more dramatic than her parents had initially realized. Her father, Thomas Brooks, later documented in his private diary that his daughter's personality seemed to have undergone a complete transformation. The vibrant, curious young woman who had entered the convent had been replaced by someone who spoke in monotone responses and seemed unable to engage in the kind of spirited discussions that had once characterized her interactions with family members. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with intelligence and humor, now held a vacant quality that her parents found deeply disturbing. When Helen's father, Thomas Brooks, expressed concern about his daughter's appearance, Mother Superior Wells assured him that such changes were normal for young women, adjusting to the rigorous spiritual and physical demands of convent life. She explained that the sisters' strict dietary regimen, intensive prayer schedule, and manual labor naturally resulted in weight loss and a more ethereal appearance. The flesh must be subdued for the spirit to flourish, she told concerned families, an explanation that seemed to satisfy most parents who wanted to believe their daughters were achieving spiritual enlightenment. However, Brooks was not entirely convinced by these explanations. He began to make more frequent visits to the convent, during which he carefully observed his daughter's behavior and physical condition. What he noticed was a pattern of changes that seemed inconsistent with normal spiritual development. Helen's hands, which had once been smooth and soft, now bore calluses and small scars that she could not adequately explain. Her posture had changed dramatically, as if she were constantly bracing herself against some expected pain or punishment. Most troubling was her apparent inability to remember details about her life before entering the convent, as if her past had been systematically erased. The physical deterioration that Brooks observed in his daughter extended beyond simple weight loss. Helen's hair had become thin and brittle. Her skin showed signs of frequent bruising that healed slowly, and she exhibited a nervous tremor in her hands that became more pronounced when she was questioned about her experiences at the convent. When Brooks asked about these symptoms, Helen would provide vague explanations about the physical demands of religious life, but her responses seemed rehearsed and disconnected from her actual experiences. Dr. James Franklin began to notice unusual patterns in his interactions with the convent around this time. While he continued to refer patients to the sisters for treatment, he observed that the women who returned from extended stays at the convent often exhibited symptoms he couldn't readily explain. Several former patients displayed tremors, memory difficulties, and what appeared to be neurological damage. When he questioned Mother Superior Wells about these symptoms, she attributed them to the natural progression of the original ailments or to the spiritual intensity of religious life. Franklin's medical records from this period, discovered years later among his personal papers, revealed the extent of his growing concerns. He documented cases of women who returned from the convent with symptoms that seemed unrelated to their original conditions. One patient, who had been treated for minor digestive problems, returned with severe scarring on her abdomen and arms. Another, who had sought help for headaches, came back with what appeared to be surgical marks on her skull. When Franklin questioned these patients about their treatment, they provided vague and often contradictory explanations that seemed to have been carefully rehearsed. The doctor's attempts to investigate these irregularities were consistently frustrated by the patients themselves, who seemed reluctant or unable to provide detailed accounts of their experiences at the convent. Many appeared to suffer from what Franklin privately described as memory disorders, characterized by gaps in their recollection of events and an apparent inability to form coherent narratives about their treatment. When pressed for details, these women would often become distressed and would request to end the consultation immediately. Franklin also began to notice patterns in the timing and nature of referrals from the convent. Patients who were returned to his care often required treatment for complications that seemed to result from medical procedures rather than from their original conditions. The sisters would provide detailed reports about the treatments they had administered, but these reports often failed to explain the new symptoms and injuries that Franklin observed. When he questioned these discrepancies, he was told that the patients had experienced unexpected complications or had developed secondary conditions during their stay at the convent. More concerning were the reports from townspeople who worked closely with the convent. William Harris, a local merchant who delivered supplies to the sisters, began to notice that certain areas of the convent were strictly off-limits to outsiders. He reported hearing unusual sounds, what he described as moaning and mechanical noises, coming from the underground areas during his deliveries. When he mentioned these observations to Mother Superior Wells, she explained that the sisters often engaged in intensive prayer sessions in the lower levels, and that the sounds were simply the echoes of their devotions through the stone corridors. Harris's concerns were initially dismissed by other townspeople, who pointed out that religious institutions often had private areas where outsiders were not welcome. However, his observations became more detailed and troubling over time. He reported seeing construction materials and equipment being delivered to the convent that seemed inappropriate for a religious institution. Heavy machinery, surgical instruments, and what appeared to be restraining devices were among the items he observed being transported to the basement areas. When Harris questioned the nature of these deliveries, he was told that the sisters were expanding their medical facilities to better serve the community. The merchant also noticed changes in the behavior of the sisters themselves. The women who had once greeted him warmly and engaged in friendly conversation during his deliveries became increasingly distant and formal. Several sisters who had previously been regular fixtures in the convent's daily operations simply disappeared without explanation. When Harris inquired about these absent sisters, he was told that they had been transferred to other institutions or had been selected for special assignments that required them to work in isolation. Harris began to keep detailed records of his observations, documenting the unusual deliveries, the strange sounds he heard, and the changes in the sisters' behavior. His notes, preserved in his family's papers, provide a contemporaneous account of the growing signs that something was seriously wrong at the convent. The merchant's background in trade had given him a keen eye for inconsistencies and unusual patterns, skills that proved valuable in documenting the early warning signs of the convent's criminal activities. The pattern of disappearances began to establish itself more clearly by 1797. Young women who entered the convent would initially maintain correspondence with their families, but these letters would gradually become less frequent and more generic in tone. Eventually, families would receive notification that their daughters had been selected for special missionary work in distant territories and would be unable to maintain regular contact. The letters announcing these departures were always written in the same formal script and signed by Mother Superior Wells rather than by the young women themselves. Robert Anderson, a blacksmith whose daughter Dorothy had entered the convent in early 1797, became increasingly suspicious when he received one of these standardized departure letters. Dorothy had been an avid letter writer who maintained detailed correspondence with several family members, but the final letter allegedly from her contained none of her characteristic expressions or references to shared family experiences. The handwriting, while resembling Dorothy's, lacked the spontaneous flourishes and personal touches that had always characterized her correspondence. When Anderson attempted to visit the convent to speak with his daughter before her supposed departure, he was told that she had already left for her mission and that her destination was confidential for security reasons. Mother Superior Wells explained that the missionary work being conducted in frontier territories was dangerous, and that maintaining contact with families could put both the missionaries and the communities they served at risk. She assured Anderson that his daughter was serving God in the most meaningful way possible, and that her sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. Anderson's attempts to investigate his daughter's whereabouts were systematically frustrated by official channels. When he approached colonial authorities for assistance, he was told that religious institutions had the right to manage their own affairs, and that interference with missionary work could have serious diplomatic consequences with Native American tribes. The officials he contacted seemed remarkably well informed about the convent's operations and consistently defended the institution's practices, even when presented with evidence that suggested irregularities. The blacksmith's persistence in seeking information about his daughter led to increasing pressure from both official and unofficial sources. His business began to suffer as customers were discouraged from patronizing his shop, and he found himself excluded from social gatherings and community events where he had previously been welcome. The message was clear: his continued inquiries about the convent were unwelcome and could have serious consequences for his livelihood and social standing. The convent's financial activities also began to attract attention from those who observed them closely. Charles Baker, a clerk at Salem's Primary Bank, noticed that the sisters' accounts showed unusual patterns of activity. Large deposits would appear regularly, but the sources of these funds were not clearly documented. When Baker discreetly inquired about these transactions, he was told that the convent received anonymous donations from wealthy supporters throughout New England who preferred to remain unnamed for religious reasons. Baker's analysis of the convent's financial records revealed a level of wealth that seemed inconsistent with their stated sources of income. The institution's accounts showed regular deposits that far exceeded what could reasonably be expected from their known business activities and charitable donations. Moreover, the timing of these deposits seemed to correlate with the arrival of new residents at the convent, suggesting a possible connection between the two activities. The bank clerk also noticed that the convent maintained accounts under multiple names and had established complex financial arrangements that seemed designed to obscure the true sources and destinations of their funds. Payments were frequently made to suppliers and contractors whose services seemed unrelated to the convent's stated mission. Large sums were regularly transferred to institutions in distant cities, often with vague explanations that provided no real insight into the purpose of these transactions. Baker's professional training had taught him to recognize patterns that might indicate fraudulent or criminal activity, and the convent's financial behavior exhibited several warning signs. The complexity of their arrangements, the secrecy surrounding their transactions, and the apparent disconnect between their stated activities and their financial resources all suggested that something was not as it appeared. However, the convent's reputation and influence made it difficult for Baker to pursue his concerns through official channels. Local authorities received their first formal complaint about the convent in the summer of 1797. Edward Collins, whose 19-year-old daughter Mary had entered the convent 8 months earlier, filed a petition with the colonial magistrate requesting an investigation into his daughter's whereabouts. Collins argued that the convent's refusal to allow him to speak with Mary directly violated both parental rights and colonial law. The magistrate, George Mitchell, was reluctant to interfere with religious institutions, but agreed to make informal inquiries. Collins had become increasingly concerned about his daughter's situation after receiving letters that seemed to indicate she was undergoing severe physical and psychological stress. Mary's early correspondence had described her excitement about her new life and her eagerness to contribute to the convent's work. However, her later letters contained subtle references to trials and purification that suggested she was experiencing something far more difficult than normal religious training. The final letter Collins received from his daughter contained a plea for prayers and forgiveness that seemed to suggest she was in serious distress. When Mitchell visited the convent to discuss Collins's concerns, Mother Superior Wells received him with her characteristic grace and apparent transparency. She explained that Mary Collins had indeed been selected for missionary work among Native American communities in the Western Territories, where communication was difficult and potentially dangerous. Wells provided official-looking documents that appeared to verify Mary's assignment, and assured Mitchell that the young woman had embraced her calling with enthusiasm. Mitchell, who had no experience with such matters and was hesitant to question religious authorities, accepted these explanations and advised Collins to trust in his daughter's spiritual journey. The documents presented by Mother Superior Wells were impressive in their apparent authenticity and detail. They included what appeared to be official correspondence from church authorities in distant territories, detailed maps of missionary territories, and testimonials from other religious institutions about the importance of the work being conducted. However, a careful examination of these documents would later reveal inconsistencies and fabrications that suggested they had been created specifically to deceive inquiring family members and authorities. The ease with which Mother Superior Wells was able to satisfy the magistrate's inquiries revealed the extent of her influence and the sophistication of her deception. The documents she presented were professionally produced and contained enough factual information to appear credible to someone who was not familiar with the specific details of missionary work in frontier territories. Her explanations were plausible and were delivered with the authority and conviction that came from years of practice in managing such situations. The medical community began to notice additional concerning patterns. Dr. Franklin observed that several women who had spent extended periods at the convent later sought treatment for what appeared to be surgical complications. These patients exhibited scarring that was inconsistent with any standard medical procedures of the time, and they seemed reluctant or unable to explain how they had received their injuries. When questioned, these women would provide vague responses about medical treatments they had received at the convent for various ailments. Franklin's growing concern about these cases led him to begin documenting them more systematically. He created detailed medical records that included precise descriptions of each patient's injuries, their apparent age, and the circumstances under which they had been acquired. What emerged from this documentation was a pattern of injuries that seemed deliberately inflicted rather than resulting from accidents or legitimate medical procedures. The precision and consistency of these injuries suggested that they were the result of systematic and purposeful interventions. The doctor also began to notice psychological symptoms in former convent residents that seemed unrelated to their original conditions. Many exhibited signs of severe trauma, including nightmares, unexplained fears, and an apparent inability to discuss their experiences in detail. Several patients displayed what Franklin privately described as conditioned responses, reacting with extreme fear to certain words, sounds, or situations that seemed to trigger memories they could not consciously access. Franklin's medical training had not prepared him for the types of symptoms he was observing in former convent residents. The combination of physical injuries and psychological trauma suggested experiences that went far beyond normal medical treatment or religious training. The systematic nature of these symptoms and their consistency across multiple patients indicated that whatever was happening at the convent was not accidental, but was the result of deliberate and coordinated activities. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade of respectability and service, signs of something far more sinister were beginning to emerge. The stage was set for revelations that would expose the true nature of the Sisters of Divine Mercy and the horrific reality behind their carefully maintained facade of piety and service. Horror uncovered. The truth began to emerge in March 1798 through the testimony of Anna Gilbert, a young woman who had managed to escape from the convent after 18 months of imprisonment. Gilbert, barely alive and bearing physical evidence of systematic torture, stumbled into the home of Frank Reynolds, a farmer living several miles outside Salem. Her account, initially dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, would eventually expose a network of medical experimentation and systematic murder that had operated under the protection of religious authority. Hannah Gilbert's condition when she arrived at Frank Reynolds' farm was so shocking that the farmer initially believed she was a victim of an attack by wild animals or bandits. Her clothes were torn and blood-stained. Her body bore numerous scars and wounds in various stages of healing, and she appeared to be suffering from severe malnutrition and exhaustion. Most disturbing was her psychological state. She alternated between periods of catatonic silence and episodes of frantic, almost incoherent speech in which she described horrors that seemed too extreme to be believed. Reynolds, a man of practical disposition who had little patience for what he considered religious hysteria, was nevertheless moved by Gilbert's obvious distress and the physical evidence of her suffering. He provided her with food, clothing, and shelter while attempting to understand what had happened to her. Initially, Gilbert was unable to provide a coherent account of her experiences, speaking only in fragments about the sisters, the experiments, and the others who didn't survive. Her condition was so precarious that Reynolds feared she might not survive her ordeal. The farmer's wife, Martha Reynolds, played a crucial role in Gilbert's recovery. Her gentle care and patient attention gradually helped Gilbert regain some measure of physical and psychological stability. Martha's experience as a midwife had given her knowledge of treating traumatic injuries, and she was able to provide basic medical care that helped stabilize Gilbert's condition. More importantly, her compassionate presence provided Gilbert with the sense of safety and trust that was necessary for her to begin sharing her story. Anna Gilbert's testimony, recorded by Dr. Franklin after Reynolds brought her to his attention, revealed that the Sisters of Divine Mercy had been conducting what could only be described as human experimentation on young women under the guise of medical treatment and spiritual purification. According to Gilbert, new arrivals at the convent would undergo a gradual process of isolation and conditioning that began with seemingly benign medical examinations but quickly escalated into systematic torture designed to study human responses to pain, surgical procedures, and psychological manipulation. The process by which young women were inducted into the experimental program was carefully designed to prevent resistance and to ensure secrecy. Gilbert described how new arrivals would initially be treated with kindness and given comfortable accommodations while they adjusted to convent life. During this period, they would undergo what were described as routine medical examinations to assess their overall health and fitness for religious life. These examinations, conducted by Mother Superior Wells and several other sisters, were presented as necessary for determining each woman's appropriate role within the community. However, these initial examinations served a far more sinister purpose. Gilbert explained that the sisters were actually evaluating each new arrival's suitability for different types of experimentation, taking into account factors such as physical condition, psychological resilience, family connections, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. Those who were deemed suitable for the experimental program would be gradually isolated from other residents and subjected to increasingly intensive spiritual counseling, designed to break down their psychological defenses. The selection process was methodical and calculated. Gilbert described how Mother Superior Wells would spend hours interviewing each new arrival, probing for information about their family relationships, personal history, and psychological vulnerabilities. The sisters maintained detailed records on each resident, noting their responses to various forms of stress and their potential value for different types of research. Those who showed signs of strong family connections or who came from prominent families were typically assigned to less dangerous roles, while those who were more isolated or vulnerable were selected for the experimental program. The underground areas of the convent, Gilbert explained, contained facilities that bore no resemblance to any legitimate medical practice. The basement levels had been converted into a complex of surgical theaters, holding cells, and what appeared to be laboratory spaces equipped with instruments that seemed designed specifically for causing pain rather than healing. Gilbert described witnessing other young women subjected to surgical procedures without anesthesia, their screams muffled by gags, while Mother Superior Wells and several sisters observed and recorded their responses. The surgical theaters were equipped with restraining devices that allowed for complete immobilization of subjects during procedures. Gilbert described tables with leather straps and metal clamps that could hold victims in any position required for the experiments being conducted. The rooms were designed with drainage systems that suggested the expectation of significant blood loss, and the walls were lined with materials that would muffle sounds and prevent them from reaching the upper levels of the building. The instruments used in these procedures were unlike anything found in legitimate medical practice. Gilbert described devices that seemed designed specifically for causing pain, including heated metal implements, sharp instruments of various sizes and shapes, and mechanical devices that could apply precise amounts of pressure to different parts of the body. Many of these instruments appeared to have been specially crafted for the convent's purposes, suggesting that the experimental program had been planned and implemented over an extended period. Dr. Franklin's examination of Gilbert revealed evidence that corroborated her testimony. She bore surgical scars that indicated multiple operations, including what appeared to be experimental procedures on her reproductive organs, nervous system, and limbs. The precision of these interventions suggested advanced medical knowledge, but their purpose seemed to be investigation rather than treatment. Gilbert also exhibited signs of prolonged malnutrition and psychological trauma, consistent with extended imprisonment and systematic abuse. The medical evidence was extensive and deeply disturbing. Franklin documented over 30 distinct scars on Gilbert's body, each appearing to represent a separate surgical intervention. The locations and nature of these scars suggested that they were part of a systematic study of human anatomy and physiology. Some appeared to be exploratory incisions designed to examine internal organs, while others seemed to test the effects of various surgical techniques on different types of tissue. Most troubling were the signs of neurological experimentation. Gilbert exhibited symptoms that suggested interventions in her nervous system, including areas of numbness, altered sensation, and what appeared to be deliberately induced nerve damage. Franklin's examination revealed evidence of surgical procedures on Gilbert's skull, suggesting that the experimenters had been investigating the structure and function of the brain itself. The scope of the convent's activities became clearer as Gilbert provided details about the fate of other young women. She explained that the sisters had developed a sophisticated system for selecting subjects based on their family connections, social status, and likelihood of being missed by the broader community. Young women from distant towns or from families with limited social influence were preferred, as their disappearances were less likely to attract attention from authorities. Gilbert's account revealed that she had been selected for the experimental program because her family had recently died in a house fire, leaving her without close relatives who might inquire about her welfare. She had entered the convent seeking refuge and spiritual guidance after her tragedy, making her an ideal subject for the sisters' purposes. The selection process was deliberate and calculated, with Mother Superior Wells maintaining detailed records on each potential subject's background and circumstances. The experiments conducted on Gilbert and other victims were not random acts of cruelty, but rather a systematic program of research into human anatomy, psychology, and what could only be described as the limits of human endurance. Mother Superior Wells, who Gilbert described as the primary architect of these activities, maintained detailed records of each experiment, including precise measurements, observations, and conclusions. These records, according to Gilbert, were kept in a hidden library within the convent's underground complex. Gilbert described witnessing Mother Superior Wells conducting what appeared to be scientific studies of pain tolerance, healing rates, and psychological responses to trauma. The experiments were conducted with methodical precision, with careful attention to controlling variables and documenting results. Wells seemed to view her victims as laboratory specimens rather than human beings, displaying no emotion or compassion during even the most brutal procedures. The experimental program included studies of human reproduction, pain perception, psychological conditioning, and what appeared to be attempts to develop new surgical techniques. Gilbert described witnessing procedures that seemed designed to test the limits of human survival, including deliberate infliction of injuries to study healing processes and experiments that involved the systematic removal of various organs to observe their effects on the subject's condition. The religious facade of the convent served multiple purposes beyond simply providing cover for these activities. The sisters' vows of silence ensured that even legitimate members of the community would not discuss what they witnessed, while the institution's reputation for treating difficult young women provided a ready explanation for why residents might appear troubled or exhibit unusual behavior. The convent's charitable works and medical services to the broader community created a steady stream of potential victims while maintaining the trust of local authorities. Gilbert's testimony included disturbing details about the psychological methods used to control victims. New arrivals would be subjected to what the sisters called spiritual counseling, which involved systematic degradation, isolation, and the use of religious concepts to justify the treatment they received. Women who resisted were subjected to increasingly severe punishments, while those who complied were told that their suffering was necessary for spiritual purification and scientific advancement. The psychological conditioning employed by the sisters was sophisticated and effective. Gilbert described being told that her suffering was a form of penance for her sins, and that enduring the experiments would purify her soul and bring her closer to God. The sisters used religious terminology and concepts to frame the torture as a form of spiritual discipline, making resistance seem like a rejection of divine will. Victims were also subjected to systematic isolation and sensory deprivation, designed to break down their psychological defenses. Gilbert described being confined in small, dark cells for extended periods, during which she was deprived of human contact and subjected to constant surveillance. The isolation was broken only for experimental sessions or for periods of intense psychological manipulation, designed to reinforce her dependence on her captors. The revelation of these activities prompted Dr. Franklin to conduct his own investigation, during which he discovered additional evidence that corroborated Gilbert's account. Records from his own practice revealed that several women who had sought treatment after leaving the convent had exhibited symptoms consistent with surgical trauma and psychological conditioning. When he reviewed these cases with Gilbert's testimony in mind, patterns emerged that he had previously attributed to natural illness or spiritual stress. Franklin's investigation revealed that the symptoms he had observed in former convent residents were consistent with the experimental program described by Gilbert. The mysterious scars, neurological symptoms, and psychological disorders that had puzzled him now made sense as the results of systematic torture and experimentation. The doctor realized that he had been unknowingly treating victims of these crimes for years, without recognizing the true nature of their conditions. The medical evidence gathered by Franklin was extensive and damning. In addition to his examination of Gilbert, he conducted detailed reviews of all patients who had received treatment at the convent during the previous 5 years. The patterns that emerged were clear and consistent, showing a systematic program of medical experimentation that had affected dozens of young women over an extended period. Local authorities' initial response to Gilbert's testimony was skepticism and resistance. Magistrate George Mitchell, who had previously accepted Mother Superior Wells' explanations about missing young women, was reluctant to believe that such activities could have occurred under his jurisdiction without his knowledge. However, as Dr. Franklin presented his medical findings and other community members began to come forward with their own observations, the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the convent's criminal network. Henry Wallace, a government clerk who had been quietly documenting irregularities in the convent's financial records, came forward with evidence that the sisters had been receiving payments from wealthy individuals throughout New England in exchange for conducting specific types of experiments. These payments, disguised as charitable donations, had funded the convent's activities and provided financial incentives for expanding their operations. Wallace's financial analysis revealed a complex network of transactions that connected the convent to wealthy individuals and institutions throughout the colonies. The payments were carefully structured to avoid detection, using multiple intermediaries and coded language to disguise their true purpose. The amounts involved were substantial, suggesting that the experimental program was not only systematic, but also highly profitable for those involved. The financial records also revealed connections to medical schools and research institutions that had been receiving reports and specimens from the convent's experimental program. These institutions had apparently been unaware of the true nature of the research being conducted, believing that they were receiving legitimate medical data from a respected religious institution. Thomas Lambert, a former employee of the convent who had been dismissed for asking too many questions, provided additional testimony about the institution's operations. Lambert described witnessing the arrival of supplies that seemed inappropriate for a religious institution, including surgical instruments, chemicals, and what appeared to be restraining devices. He also testified about the construction of specialized rooms in the basement that he had been told were for advanced medical treatment, but which seemed designed for imprisonment rather than healing. Lambert's testimony provided crucial details about the physical infrastructure that supported the experimental program. He described the construction of soundproof rooms, drainage systems designed to handle large quantities of biological waste, and ventilation systems that would prevent odors from reaching the upper levels of the building. The complexity and expense of these modifications suggested that the experimental program had been planned and implemented over many years. The former employee also provided information about the arrival of unusual equipment and supplies that seemed inconsistent with the convent's stated mission. He described deliveries of restraining devices, surgical instruments that appeared designed for torture rather than healing, and chemicals that seemed intended for preserving specimens rather than treating patients. The secrecy surrounding these deliveries and the restrictions placed on his access to certain areas of the building had aroused his suspicions and eventually led to his dismissal. The discovery of physical evidence at the convent confirmed the most horrific aspects of Gilbert's testimony. When authorities finally obtained a warrant to search the premises, they found the underground complex exactly as Gilbert had described it. The surgical theaters contained instruments that appeared to be designed specifically for torture, while the holding cells bore evidence of prolonged use. Most disturbing was the discovery of Mother Superior Wells's research library, which contained detailed records of experiments conducted on dozens of young women over nearly 2 decades. The records discovered in Mother Superior Wells's library were extensive and meticulously maintained. They included detailed descriptions of each experiment, precise measurements and observations, and what appeared to be scientific conclusions drawn from the research. The clinical tone of these documents was perhaps more disturbing than their content, as they demonstrated the systematic and deliberate nature of the crimes that had been committed. The documentation included detailed anatomical drawings, charts tracking the progression of various experimental procedures, and what appeared to be correspondence with medical professionals in other colonies who were conducting similar research. The records indicated that the experimental program at the Sisters of Divine Mercy was part of a broader network of institutions engaged in human experimentation, with Mother Superior Wells serving as a coordinator and distributor of research findings. Among the most disturbing discoveries were detailed records of individual victims, including their backgrounds, the specific experiments conducted on them, and their ultimate fates. The records indicated that very few subjects survived the complete experimental program, with most dying from complications related to the procedures or from deliberate termination when they were no longer useful. For research purposes, the bodies of deceased subjects were apparently disposed of through methods that ensured they would never be discovered or identified. The records revealed that the convent's activities had been far more extensive than even Gilbert had understood. The sisters had maintained detailed documentation of their experiments, including precise measurements of subjects' responses to various treatments, observations about the effectiveness of different psychological manipulation techniques, and what appeared to be attempts to develop new methods of surgical intervention. The clinical tone of these records, combined with their meticulous detail, suggested that the sisters viewed their victims as test subjects rather than human beings. The investigation also revealed that the convent's network extended beyond Salem. Correspondence found in Mother Superior Wells's private chambers indicated that she had been in contact with similar institutions in other colonies, sharing information about experimental techniques, and coordinating the transfer of subjects between facilities. This network appeared to be part of a larger program of research that had been operating under the protection of religious and political authorities throughout New England. The correspondence revealed connections to institutions in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston, suggesting that the experimental program was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. The letters discussed the sharing of research findings, the development of new experimental techniques, and the coordination of subject transfers between facilities. The language used in these communications was coded and euphemistic, but the meaning was clear to those who understood the context. The testimony of other survivors began to emerge as news of the investigation spread. Several young women who had been presumed dead or missing came forward with accounts that corroborated Gilbert's testimony. These individuals, who had been too traumatized or intimidated to speak previously, provided additional details about the convent's operations and helped investigators understand the full scope of the criminal enterprise. One of these survivors, Marie Douglas, had managed to escape from the convent 2 years earlier, but had been too terrified to report her experiences to authorities. Her testimony provided crucial details about the selection process for experimental subjects and the methods used to prevent victims from seeking help. Douglas described being told that her family had disowned her and that no one outside the convent would believe her accounts of what had occurred. Another survivor, Rose Jennings, had been released from the convent after several months but had been too psychologically damaged to provide coherent testimony until after Gilbert's revelations. Jennings described witnessing the deaths of several other young women during experimental procedures and provided details about the disposal of bodies that corroborated evidence found during the investigation. The psychological conditioning employed by the sisters was revealed to be far more sophisticated than initially understood. Survivors described being subjected to systematic brainwashing techniques designed to make them compliant and to prevent them from seeking help even if they managed to escape. The methods included sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, systematic humiliation, and the use of drugs that affected their ability to think clearly or remember events accurately. The revelations about the Sisters of Divine Mercy sent shockwaves through Salem and the broader Massachusetts Bay Colony. The institution that had been held up as a model of religious devotion and charitable service was revealed to be a front for systematic torture and murder. The implications of these discoveries extended beyond the immediate crimes, raising fundamental questions about the oversight of religious institutions and the potential for similar activities to occur elsewhere. The community's response to these revelations was one of horror and disbelief. Many residents had difficulty accepting that an institution they had respected and supported for decades had been engaged in such horrific activities. The discovery forced a fundamental re-evaluation of assumptions about religious authority and the potential for trusted institutions to abuse their positions of power and respect. The investigation revealed that the experimental program had been operating for nearly 2 decades, during which time dozens of young women had been subjected to systematic torture and murder. The scope and duration of these activities suggested a level of planning and organization that indicated the involvement of individuals and institutions beyond the convent itself. Legacy and silence. The official response to the revelations about the Sisters of Divine Mercy was swift and decisive, not in terms of justice but in terms of suppression. Within days of the investigation's initial findings, colonial authorities implemented what would become one of the most comprehensive cover-ups in American history. The urgency of this response was driven not by a desire to protect public safety, but by the recognition that the full extent of the convent's activities could destabilize the entire colonial government and reveal the complicity of prominent officials throughout New England. The decision to suppress the investigation was made at the highest levels of colonial government, with Governor Samuel Warren personally coordinating the effort. Warren, who had previously praised the convent's work and had made several official visits to the institution, recognized that the exposure of the experimental program would not only destroy his political career, but could also undermine confidence in the colonial government's ability. To protect its citizens, the governor moved quickly to contain the damage, using every resource at his disposal to ensure that the truth would never reach the public. The cover-up operation was extensive and sophisticated, involving multiple government agencies and private contractors who were brought in to manage different aspects of the suppression effort. Teams of agents were assigned to remove physical evidence, intimidate witnesses, and control the flow of information about the investigation. The operation was conducted with military precision, suggesting that plans for such a cover-up had been prepared well in advance of the actual discovery of the crimes. Governor Samuel Warren, who had previously praised the convent's work and had made several official visits to the institution, personally ordered the immediate sealing of all records related to the investigation. The documents discovered in Mother Superior Wells' research library, which contained evidence of systematic experimentation and torture spanning nearly 2 decades, were removed from official custody and reportedly destroyed, though. Some evidence suggests they may have been transferred to private collections or government archives that remain classified to this day. The process of suppressing the evidence was methodical and thorough. Teams of government agents, working under direct orders from the governor's office, removed all physical evidence from the convent and from the offices of officials who had been involved in the investigation. Documents were either destroyed or transferred to secure locations where they could not be accessed by unauthorized individuals. The underground complex where the experiments had been conducted was sealed and filled with concrete, ostensibly for structural reasons but actually to prevent future investigation. The destruction of evidence was carried out with unusual speed and efficiency, suggesting that detailed plans had been prepared for such an eventuality. The agents involved in this work were carefully selected for their reliability and discretion, and many were brought in from distant locations to ensure that they had no personal connections to the Salem community or to the victims of the crimes. The cover-up extended beyond simply removing evidence. Key witnesses were systematically intimidated, relocated, or eliminated. The techniques employed were subtle but effective, relying on economic pressure, social isolation, and in some cases, more direct forms of coercion. The goal was to ensure that no credible witnesses remained who could provide testimony about what had occurred at the convent. The fate of Mother Superior Wells herself became the first indication of how thoroughly the truth would be buried. Rather than facing trial for her crimes, Wells was reportedly transferred to a private facility in Boston, where she died under mysterious circumstances within weeks of her arrest. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes related to her advanced age, but Dr. Franklin, who had been involved in the initial investigation, privately expressed doubts about this explanation. His own notes, discovered decades later, suggest that he suspected Wells had been poisoned to prevent her from revealing the extent of the network that had supported the convent's activities. The circumstances surrounding Wells's death were suspicious from the beginning. She had been in good health at the time of her arrest and had shown no signs of illness during her initial interrogations. The facility where she died was a private institution with connections to the colonial government, and the physicians who attended her during her final days were known to have close relationships with government officials. No autopsy was performed, and her body was cremated immediately after her death, preventing any future investigation into the true cause of her demise. Dr. Franklin's private notes, discovered years later among his personal papers, revealed his growing suspicions about Wells's death. He had attempted to visit her at the facility where she was being held, but had been denied access on the grounds that she was too ill to receive visitors. When he learned of her death, he requested permission to examine the body, but was told that it had already been disposed of according to her religious beliefs. The physician's notes also revealed his concerns about the broader implications of the cover-up. Franklin had begun to realize that the experimental program at the convent was part of a larger network of criminal activity that extended throughout the colonies, and he feared that his own involvement in exposing the crimes had made him a target for elimination. His increasing paranoia and eventual decision to leave Salem suggest that his fears were well-founded. The other sisters who had been involved in the experimental program met various fates, none of which involved public trial or accountability. Some were reportedly transferred to other institutions, while others simply disappeared from official records. The few sisters who had been genuine religious practitioners and had no knowledge of the criminal activities were relocated to convents in distant colonies, where they were sworn to secrecy about their experiences in Salem. The fate of the sisters who had participated in the experimental program was carefully managed to prevent any of them from providing testimony about their activities. Those who were considered most dangerous to the cover-up were eliminated, while others were relocated to institutions where they could be monitored and controlled. The process was carried out with efficiency and secrecy, ensuring that no loose ends remained that could threaten the success of the suppression effort. The relocation of innocent sisters was presented as a routine administrative action, but it served the crucial purpose of removing potential witnesses who might inadvertently provide information about the convent's true activities. These women were sent to institutions in distant colonies and were specifically instructed not to discuss their experiences in Salem with anyone, including other religious authorities. Anna Gilbert, whose testimony had exposed the convent's crimes, found herself increasingly isolated and threatened as the cover-up intensified. Local authorities who had initially praised her courage in coming forward began to question her mental stability and the reliability of her testimony. Dr. Franklin, who had documented her injuries and corroborated her account, came under pressure from government officials to revise his medical findings and to declare Gilbert mentally incompetent. The campaign to discredit Gilbert was sophisticated and relentless. Government agents spread rumors about her mental stability, suggesting that her testimony was the product of religious hysteria or psychological delusion. Her background was investigated and exploited, with particular attention paid to the trauma she had experienced with the loss of her family. The narrative promoted by authorities suggested that her accusations against the convent were a manifestation of grief-induced madness rather than factual accounts of her experiences. The pressure on Dr. Franklin to recant his medical findings was intense and persistent. Government officials visited his practice repeatedly, questioning his procedures and suggesting that his examination of Gilbert had been flawed or biased. They offered him financial incentives to revise his conclusions and threatened professional sanctions if he continued to support Gilbert's testimony. The stress of this pressure began to affect Franklin's health and his ability to maintain his medical practice. Gilbert herself faced constant surveillance and harassment that made it impossible for her to live in Salem. Her attempts to find employment were frustrated by rumors about her mental state, and her few remaining supporters were systematically discouraged from maintaining contact with her. The isolation and pressure eventually forced her to leave Massachusetts entirely, though her subsequent fate remained unknown for many years. The systematic intimidation of witnesses became apparent as other survivors attempted to come forward. Several young women who had initially provided testimony about their experiences at the convent began to recant their statements, claiming they had been confused or mistaken about what they had witnessed. Others simply disappeared, leaving behind only brief notes indicating they had decided to relocate to distant territories where they could start new lives. The methods used to silence witnesses were varied and effective. Some were offered financial incentives to relocate and remain silent about their experiences. Others faced economic pressure that made it impossible for them to remain in their communities. In several cases, survivors who refused to cooperate with the cover-up were declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized, effectively removing them from public view and discrediting any future testimony they might provide. The disappearance of witnesses was often explained as voluntary relocation, but evidence suggests that some may have met more sinister fates. Several survivors who had initially provided detailed testimony about their experiences simply vanished without leaving any trace of their whereabouts. Their families were told that they had chosen to start new lives elsewhere, but no evidence of their continued existence was ever discovered. The physical evidence from the convent was eliminated with remarkable efficiency. The underground complex where the experiments had been conducted was sealed and filled with concrete, officially described as a necessary structural reinforcement for the building above. The surgical instruments, research records, and other materials that had been discovered during the investigation were reportedly destroyed, though some community members suspected that valuable items had been secretly transferred to other institutions. The destruction of physical evidence was carried out by teams of workers who had been specifically selected for their reliability and discretion. These individuals were brought in from distant locations and had no connections to the Salem community, ensuring that they would have no personal interest in preserving or publicizing the evidence they were tasked with destroying. The work was conducted under heavy security, with government agents supervising every aspect of the operation. The decision to fill the underground complex with concrete was presented as a safety measure, but it effectively made future investigation impossible. The areas where the most horrific crimes had been committed were rendered permanently inaccessible, ensuring that no physical evidence of the experimental program could ever be recovered. The efficiency with which this was accomplished suggested that the destruction had been planned well in advance of the official investigation. The convent building itself was eventually demolished, with officials citing structural concerns and the need to use the land for other purposes. The demolition was carried out by workers brought in from distant locations, none of whom had connections to the Salem community. The site was eventually converted into a public park, with no memorial or acknowledgement of what had occurred there. The demolition of the convent was presented as a routine administrative decision, but it served the crucial purpose of eliminating any remaining physical evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. The building's destruction was carried out with unusual speed and thoroughness, with every trace of the original structure being removed and disposed of in ways that prevented future investigation. The conversion of the site into a public park was seen as a positive development by most community members, who welcomed the creation of a pleasant recreational space. However, the irony of using the site of systematic murder and torture for public enjoyment was not lost on those who knew the truth about what had occurred there. The park's design deliberately obscured any indication of the building that had previously occupied the site. The broader implications of the cover-up extended throughout the colonial government and beyond. Several officials who had been involved in the initial investigation found their careers destroyed or were transferred to distant postings. Dr. Franklin, who had played a crucial role in documenting the crimes, faced increasing pressure to abandon his medical practice and eventually left Salem entirely. His detailed notes about the investigation and his medical examinations of the victims were reportedly confiscated by government agents. The career destruction of officials who had been involved in the investigation served as a clear warning to others who might be tempted to pursue the truth about the convent's activities. The message was unmistakable. Those who threatened the success of the cover-up would face serious consequences for their actions. The efficiency with which these individuals were removed from positions of influence demonstrated the reach and power of those who were coordinating the suppression effort. Dr. Franklin's experience was particularly instructive about the methods used to silence potential witnesses. The pressure he faced was both professional and personal, affecting not only his medical practice, but also his relationships with colleagues and his standing in the community. The confiscation of his notes and medical records was presented as a routine administrative action, but it effectively eliminated crucial evidence that could have supported future investigations. The physician's eventual departure from Salem was officially attributed to his desire to seek new opportunities elsewhere, but evidence suggests that he was forced to leave by the pressure and threats he faced for his role in exposing the convent's crimes. His subsequent career was marked by a reluctance to become involved in controversial cases, suggesting that his experience in Salem had taught him the dangers of challenging powerful interests. The network of institutions that had been connected to the Sisters of Divine Mercy was systematically dismantled or reorganized. Correspondence found in Mother Superior Wells' chambers had implicated similar facilities in other colonies, but rather than conducting thorough investigations, authorities chose to quietly close these institutions or transfer their operations to new locations. The individuals who had been involved in coordinating these activities were either relocated to positions where they could be monitored or eliminated entirely. The dismantling of the broader network was carried out with the same efficiency and secrecy that characterized other aspects of the cover-up. Institutions that had been involved in the experimental program were either closed or reorganized under new management, with their previous activities being officially forgotten. The individuals who had been involved in coordinating these activities disappeared from public view, their fates unknown but presumably managed in ways that ensured their silence. The scope of the network that had supported the experimental program was never fully revealed, but evidence suggests that it extended throughout the colonies and possibly beyond. The systematic way in which it was dismantled indicated that authorities had detailed knowledge of its operations and the resources necessary to eliminate it completely. The financial aspects of the cover-up were as comprehensive as the suppression of evidence. The convent's substantial assets, which had been accumulated through both legitimate donations and payments for experimental services, were seized by the colonial government. Rather than being used to compensate victims or their families, these funds were reportedly transferred to a discretionary account that was used to finance the cover-up itself and to provide payments to individuals who agreed to remain silent about what they had witnessed. The seizure of the convent's assets was presented as a routine legal procedure, but the disposition of these funds was carefully managed to support the cover-up effort. Large sums were used to relocate witnesses, compensate individuals who agreed to remain silent, and fund the various activities necessary to suppress evidence and maintain secrecy. The financial resources available for this effort were substantial, indicating the importance that authorities placed on ensuring the success of the suppression. The use of the convent's own funds to finance the cover-up of its crimes added an additional layer of irony to the situation. The money that had been generated through systematic torture and murder was used to ensure that the truth about these activities would never be revealed. This arrangement also created a self-sustaining system that reduced the need for additional government funding to support the suppression effort. Today, the site where the convent once stood remains a public park, with no indication of the horrors that occurred there. The victims of the Sisters of Divine Mercy have been forgotten, their suffering erased from official history. The survivors who tried to tell their stories have been dismissed as unreliable witnesses or mentally unstable individuals. The truth about what happened in Salem between 1765 and 1798 remains buried beneath layers of official denial and systematic suppression. The park that now occupies the site of the convent serves as a monument to the success of the cover-up. Families picnic where young women were once tortured and murdered. Children play where systematic experiments were conducted on human subjects, and visitors enjoy peaceful walks through gardens that were built over the graves of forgotten victims. The irony of this transformation is lost on those who have no knowledge of what occurred there. The erasure of the victims from historical memory represents perhaps the greatest tragedy of the entire affair. The young women who suffered and died at the hands of the Sisters of Divine Mercy have been denied even the basic dignity of being remembered. Their names, their stories, and their suffering have all been deliberately forgotten, leaving no trace of their existence or acknowledgement of the injustice they endured. The case of the Sisters of Divine Mercy stands as a stark reminder of how institutions can use their respected positions to commit unspeakable crimes, and how political authorities can choose to protect their own interests rather than serve justice. The young women who disappeared into the convent's underground complex deserve to be remembered, but their stories have been deliberately erased from history. The questions raised by their fate about institutional oversight, government accountability, and the protection of vulnerable individuals remain as relevant today as they were more than 2 centuries ago. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.